Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with an overall view of improv builds for the Deceiver, which is the Occultist Inquisitor combination. If you don't have any equipment for this combination, or late game equipment at the very least for this combination, or you just want to play around with the combination because you've never used it before, and you're not sure where you want to take it, this is really what the video is intended for. I will eventually down the road be doing more and more specific builds for each of the classes, but right now, I'm looking at it from an improv perspective, so that way new players who have no items can at least start a build and maybe adapt it as they find equipment for it. With that being said, I want to start off this video by talking about a rough build focus that isn't talked about a whole lot. It's well known, but not a whole lot of people necessarily talk about it anymore. It used to be talked about a lot when Inquisitor was first released, but I haven't really seen a whole lot of discussion on elemental deceivers recently, so let's start off with that. Because the core foundation of the elemental deceiver is the crow. This is basically going to be, by and large, the only thing you're going to pull out of the occultist class with an elemental deceiver. Now, if you decide you really want to go into Curse of Frailty and Vulnerability, which I don't really recommend, but you can, that's fine. But I don't really recommend it because it won't necessarily need it so much. There are other alternatives to that. For example, you could go with Aura of Censure. Now, before we get into Aura of Censure, because there's actually some caveats to that, I want to talk about ranged versus melee elemental deceivers. Ranged elemental deceivers have a distinct advantage because ranged expertise provides extra pierce damage and extra elemental damage, which is very, very important. As I've been saying pretty consistently so far throughout most of my Grim Dawn videos, elemental damage has something of a small problem that a lot of enemies are resistant to one or the other of these elements. So you're only going to generally be doing roughly 2/3 of your actual shown elemental damage. In most cases. There are some enemies that have 0 elemental resistances of any kind, but these are very rare. Broadly speaking, most everything resists at least one element. So having the pierce damage as a secondary damage type and boosting that damage is quite important because there's very few things that are heavily resistant to pierce damage. So that becomes a very effective secondary damage type that you can rely on for those situations where the enemy is resistant to 2 or more of your elements, which, again, does occasionally happen. Now, you have a bunch of options at this point Inquisitor-wise here, but to actually go back to Aura of Censure for a minute, if you're running a ranged elemental deceiver, you're using Aura of Censure defensively. You're shooting the enemy melee guys, they come in, they get into melee range, then they start getting burned by Aura of Censure. You're running forward to trigger Aura of Censure against ranged enemies is something of a risk, because your crow may not follow you. If you have your crow set to defensive, it probably will follow you to the point where you're still within the 20-meter range of the full Storm Spirit. Right? But not always. Even though the Familiar's AI has improved over various updates, it's still not perfect, and there are moments I have seen the crow just simply set a pick and not follow me. It happens once in a while. So, you are taking a mild risk by running forward and trying to get ranged enemies in the Aura of Censure, because your crow may not be close enough to either have you benefit from the aura or even heal you. I have had that happen a couple of times. That's very rare where it's too far away to heal you, but I have had it happen. But just be aware of the fact that if you're running forward to force Aura of Censure to target enemy ranged, your crow may not be in range of you anymore. Or vice versa, you're not in range of the crow anymore. Yeah, obviously you get too far away, it teleports to you, but in most fights you're not going to get that far away that it teleports to you instantly, so. But from here you have a whole bunch of different options, and which way you generally are going to take this depends primarily on your weapon. Now, as you run through the game, as you level up, and as you're discovering various weapons, you're going to pick up a whole bunch of different weapons. You're going to be experimented with a whole bunch of different weapons. And what type of damage that weapon does is going to decide pretty heavily what abilities you'll be taking, because you'll want to emphasize that damage type for the obvious reason that you're already using a weapon that does that damage type. Or, alternatively, you really don't like the idea of focusing on one element and using the other elements as secondary types, and you want to pick skills that do the other elements that your weapon isn't doing. There's those two different approaches, and neither one is wrong. Both are perfectly valid, both are perfectly justified. They have legitimate trains of thought that both work. There are situations in which one will have the advantage, and there are situations in which the other one will have the advantage. It depends on the enemy. Regardless, pretty consistently, I would recommend Word of Pain. It does elemental damage across the board. Once you get Word of Agony, you're doing lightning, fire, and cold, so it doesn't matter. It's decreasing enemy health regeneration, which, by the way, is sometimes life-saving in the Shattered Realm. There are some modifiers in the Shattered Realm where health regeneration of enemies is, like, doubled or something like that. It's ridiculous. So this can occasionally be extremely important, but if you're not intending this build to be a end-of-game grind build, don't worry about it. But most off, Death Sentence offers a decrease in enemy pierce resistance, which is a good time. This is especially useful. I would actually strongly encourage this if you're playing with friends. I play with family members a lot, and anytime I play with them and I'm running Inquisitor, Occultist, Deceiver, which is occasional, it's not one of my favorite combinations, but I play it occasionally, Death Sentence, every time. I'm benefiting from the pierce resistance decrease. Maybe one of my family members is benefiting from the Aether resistance decrease because they're doing a lot of Aether damage, and another one is benefiting from the Chaos resistance because they're doing Chaos damage. If you have at least 2 friends who play this game or are interested in playing this game, you can coordinate with them, absolutely. That's a fantastic time. Just the 3 of you against the world, one doing Aether, one doing Chaos, and one focusing on Element and Pierce. It can get really disgusting, especially if one of your friends picks up Arcanist, goes into Wisconder's Elemental Exchange. Oh, wow, that's a good time, let me tell you something. But anyways, back to the point. This is generally always going to be a really strong option regardless of whether or not you decide to focus on a specific element, but some specific points of note here would be, which element you want to focus on. A lot of these don't really need explanation. I mean, this is fairly self-explanatory. It's just, I don't really need to necessarily explain the individual skills. It all comes down to what you want to do, how diverse you want your elemental damage to be. But, on that note, do keep in mind that Rune of Huggerod does piercing damage, which is fairly important. So it's at least worth considering the Rune of Huggerod for actually 2 reasons. Not only does it do pierce damage, but it slows the enemy and can freeze them, which is great. So regardless of what elemental damage you necessarily want to focus on, it's at least worth considering the Rune of Huggerod because it will give you quite a bit of benefits. It does piercing damage, which is really nice, which Callistory used to do piercing damage as well. They converted that piercing damage into physical and fire damage, and it no longer does pierce damage, not even at this point with Ignition. So it's not quite as useful as Rune of Huggerod is. Furthermore, it can't freeze enemies. Yes, it does more damage because of the burn, but the pierce damage here, plus the potential to freeze them at the Chill Surge stage, is quite impactful. Whether or not you care for Stormbox really depends. I don't use this very often. I find this very weak. I usually only use it if I'm going to be pulling out the Arcane Net, personally. Even then, I'm not a huge fan of the Stormbox of Elgoloth. That's a personal thing. I have family members who love this to pieces. I have personally both used this and seen others use this to great effect. I just am not hugely fond of the effect. It's extremely good on bosses and heroes and nemeses, but in large-scale enemy confrontations, it's pretty often where whoever you've just Stormboxed dies a couple of seconds later, and you don't even get the benefit of the tether. If you have the tether, if you actually go all the way out to the lightning tether. So, it's just a personal quibble I have with it. But you absolutely can pick whatever you want here. Again, the Rune of Huggerod is always worth considering. It is also always worth considering the Inquisitor Seal for the damage absorption, and the increased health regeneration, and the elemental resistance. Even if you don't care about Rebuke, the barrier is worth it. And Arcane Empowerment as well, increasing both your piercing and your elemental damage, your damage in general. This also, again, can boost your Crow. and also can boost any allies you may be playing with. If you're playing with teammates, this is an even heavier thing to contemplate. This might receive a bit more emphasis in the weighing of what skills you want, because it really is potentially that magnificently useful. Now, a couple of other things I'd like to point out is if you are going with elements broadly and you want to use both runes, absolutely grab artifact handling. It actually is fairly impressive because it can give you quite an impressive increase in stats. Consider minus 1.5 second recharge. You already have a 4-second recharge here, and you can have up to 5 of these. Just the default. This does not even include anything else. All right, keep that in mind. And then you can already have, this is the same thing, right? So you can just span these out, because that's a 2.5 second recharge when you have artifact handling, and it can get it very ugly very quickly. So if you want both runes, please go for artifact handling. It can get very disturbing, and your damage is increased by 12%. What the heck would you not want that for, right? You could consider Word of Renewal. Now, whether or not you want Word of Renewal here depends on how much you trust the crow. That's basically what it comes down to. And how much you want to necessarily invest in this also depends on how you feel about your crow. You could go all the way up to Vigor for increased health, reduced freeze, petch, and trap. Maybe you want to go all the way to Steel Resolve, get some physical and elemental damage increase. Maybe your allies do internal trauma damage and you want to help them out there. Maybe, I don't know. It totally up to you, but though your decision on Word of Renewal should really come down to, do I trust my crow to save my life? That's what it comes down to, really, in all honesty. You could build it for the benefit at the end, but honestly, at that point, that's a lot of point investment there, because in order to get there, you have to have at least these down, and then go into this. Usually I'll trust my crow. Yes, I'll occasionally die more often than maybe I would like, because the crow just decides arbitrarily not to heal me, but I'll usually invest those in other points. I have used both a couple of times, but not a ton. And then, of course, which one of these shots up here you want to run with is also fairly dependent. Again, notice Chilling Rounds does piercing. This does not. This does. I do have a tendency to focus a little less on Bursting Round because it doesn't do the piercing. But, again, that's a matter of personal choice, personal preference. Horn of Gandar is amazing, by the way, because not even for the pierce damage necessarily, although that is nice, it's the confusion. This gets to confuse people at next level for up to 6 seconds. In other words, there is potential here to chain confuse people, because this only has a 4.5 second recharge. So it is worth considering. Again, this is another skill worth considering just for that alone. Really, if you've been getting the impression that you really can't go wrong with anything out of the Inquisitor set, yeah, basically. In an Elemental Deceiver build, as long as you've got the Crow, pretty much everything else is free reign. There is definitely an emphasis on using ranged. Again, not only does this keep you close to the Crow, but a lot of the, the best parts of benefiting from the Crow's elemental aura is going to be the top row of the ranged automatic passive trigger attacks. But you can still run a melee version of this with the Crow. It's just going to be a little less consistent, I would say. That's about the only thing I can say. There are great builds out there for melee. There are equipment sets for that. But keep in mind that your Crow won't be as consistently useful in that circumstance. And then there are, of course, items out there that change the damage of one of Occultist ability into elemental. We'll get with those in another. We'll get onto those in another video. Don't worry about it so much. But the other way to approach the Deceiver is Vitality and Chaos. And that being the case, you're running Possession, obviously. You're probably also going to run Tainted Flame, Chaos and Vitality damage. Delicious. Max this all the way out if you really want to. A lot of people I know will leave it at Infernal Purge. They don't necessarily go to Endless Flame. I like Endless Flame a lot, so I'll typically go to this, but you don't necessarily need to. And then maybe you want to go into Deadly Aim. Maybe you want to go into, I don't often do this, but Word of Renewal. If I'm doing a Chaos Vitality build, although Word of Renewal is nice, I'll typically rather go for Blood of Dreeg if I am going to go for that kind of thing at all. because at the very least it will enhance your vitality damage and your poison acid damage. But again, if you're going into the Chaos Vitality and Flames of Ignifar, Tainted Flame, and however many of these you want, I usually go all the way because I just really like the ability, but that's just me. Deadly Aim is something you will always want to at least... You'll probably just always want this, because this, combined with Sickle of Consumption, which converts attack damage to health, well, I believe it's 33, it's 30%. This can be quite potent. This can actually heal you quite a decent amount once you get your first critical, and hopefully you chain criticals the whole way, and just get massively boosted damage, massively boosted crit damage. It can get out of hand quite rapidly, and it can heal you a pretty impressive amount. So there is that as well. Actually, what's fairly interesting is Flames of Ignifar go all the way over here. Sickle of Consumption, Possession, and what you can do basically is go melee, right? And you throw down a Sickle of Consumption around you. Flames of Ignifar under Tainted Flame until the sickle runs out. Refresh the sickle, keep torching. Blood of Dreeg is needed. That's just a good time, honestly. You don't have to. It's just a really interesting build that I've found works pretty consistently. There is a problem, of course, against Chthonics, in which case I usually will run at least up the Focused Gaze here so I can get that poison damage on them. They're not great against poison damage. They have mediocre resistance to it. But that's a fairly good time. Or maybe you want to use Doombolt instead. That's perfectly effective as well, especially when combined with Deadly Aim, increasing your crit damage even further. This really slaps. Actually, this would be, I would say, one of the only things that can pretty consistently be useful against even Chthonics, because just the absolutely huge amounts of damage you can potentially do when you trigger Deadly Aim. Consider this. You're already doing this much damage here. You're doubling that damage if you hit them directly. And on top of that, let's say you're under the effect of Deadly Aim. That is plus 75% to that damage. And way just crit out the wazoo. You already have plus 33% here. You have another plus 18% here. That makes up for a 51% increase. I'm not 18% here. That's 15% here. What the heck? That makes for a grand whopping hairy total of 48% increased crit damage. Nearly 50%. That's pretty impressive. This doesn't even get into the boosts to vitality and chaos damage that Possession is busting out. So that can get pretty powerful as well. I just love Doombolt with this combination, personally. But you have that option. Now, you may be wondering, Professor, what about the Hellhound? Good question. The Hellhound is very good with a vitality chaos focus. Especially if you do decide you want to go into Destruction, and then you can bust out the Hellhound, go to the Hellfire, boosts all this damage, except for the Vitality. Maybe you also splash on Rune of Callistor, or you're ranged, and you want to splash in Bursting Round, although range will take you out of the Hellhound's range usually, because it's going to run up on the enemy. It's only a 15-meter target area. If you're going to use the Hellhound, you pretty much are signing on to being melee, because if you're ranged, you're not often going to get the benefit of Hellfire until the Hellhound decides to attack the melee enemies. Now again, you can set it to defensive, which helps, but once you've killed all the melee enemies, your Hellhound is going to run after the ranged enemies, and you're going to be out of range and doing less damage. Which, whether or not that matters at that point, depends on what you're fighting. Regardless, you could splash in Rune of Callistor if you're using the Hellhound, because that will be an interesting, nice boost. Especially if you're melee, you can just throw these out there. Maybe you hit the ranged enemies via the Rune of Callistor, which takes a little bit of time. It's pretty inconsistent, but it's something to at least think about. But yes, you can use the Hellhound. It's just very expensive, and you're not really going to be focusing a whole lot on the Hellhound, so you're going to find it dying pretty frequently. So you're going to find maybe Blazing Death is triggering just as often as maybe the Hellfire. So it is much riskier to use a Hellhound here, just because it is going to die a lot, and you're not necessarily going to get the benefits of the Hellfire. So if you are going to go into the Hellhound, utilize some caution. It can be quite the risky proposition to use that. If it dies, you're not getting the benefits there, and then that's some anywhere from 3 to stinking 30 points, 40 points actually. anywhere from 3 to 40 points that you're throwing into a Hellhound that's just dying all the time. I mean, I would say if you're curious, experiment with it gradually. Increase yourself first, get possession, get Sigil of Consumption, max those 3 at least, before you get the Hellhound. If you want to experiment with the Hellhound, don't even worry about Endless Flame yet, alright? Don't worry about any of these. If you want to experiment with the Hellhound, max possession, max destruction, max Sigil of Consumption. Then start putting points into the Hellhound. See how you feel about it. If you hate it, pull the points out, go into Doombolts, go into Deadly Aim. Those will never fail you. And then the rest of your points you can just throw into Flames of Ignifar and just char everything else to death. Great. But go slow and be cautious with it. The Hellhound is a risk. It can really pay off with the right items, if you have them, which this video assumes you don't. Or it goes really horribly because either you don't have the right items or your playstyle just isn't conducive to Hellhounds at this point in time. Regardless, try that. But if you're going to go into Hellhound, Possession, Destruction, Sigil of Consumption, max them out, then try it. Then start putting points into the Hellhound and see if you like it. With that being said, those are really the primary 2 ways of playing the Deceiver. There's not a whole lot of overlap with these 2 classes. There's not a whole lot of shared damage types here, so there isn't a whole lot you can do with it. You'll notice I didn't really talk about Bloody Pox. There's not really a whole lot you can do with it. If you want to splash that into a build, at least at the first stage, that's fantastic, because Bloody Pox will always be one of my favorite skills. It is always effective. But keep in mind that you're sacrificing maybe some elemental damage, maybe you're sacrificing some vitality or chaos damage. I mean, this has vitality damage, but not a whole lot. It is not a ton of vitality damage. So, it is something you can splash in there if you want the percentage reduction. But this is this is generally the 2 broad directions that the Deceiver goes in. And we'll be getting into more detail with these with future videos. I still want to cover the broad strokes of the classes, of the rest of the classes so far. So thank you all very much for joining me. I hope you found this useful. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, or suggestions, please leave them down in the comment section below. And if you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And have a great 24 hours.